Imagine it, $1 billion, 10 figures sitting in your bank account, the power to buy almost anything, go anywhere, influence practically everything. What would you do? Build an empire, change the world, maybe just kick back on a private island and enjoy the ride. You'd think that kind of wealth would be the ultimate key to happiness, a shield against the grimmer realities of life, a life lived in penthouses, not prisons. But reality? Reality can be much darker, because sometimes, behind the towering gates of those mansions, secrets fester. Sometimes the very power and isolation that wealth provides can twist a person, leading them down a path so horrific it defies belief. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're venturing far beyond the glossy pages of Forbes and into the shadows of extreme wealth. We're not talking about creative accounting or a few speeding tickets swept under the rug. No, we're diving deep into the chilling cases of billionaires who traded their bespoke suits for prison jumpsuits. Billionaires whose immense fortunes couldn't shield them from the consequences of the ultimate crime, murder. First up, it's Robert Durst. Robert was a millionaire real estate heir with a dark, twisted history. Born into one of New York's wealthiest families, Durst should have lived a quiet life of prestige. Instead, he became subject to one of the most bizarre true crime sagas in modern history. His troubles began in 1982, when his wife, Kathleen McCormack, mysteriously vanished. Durst claimed she'd gone back to medical school, but her body was never found, and no one ever heard from her again. Things got stranger in 2000, when his longtime friend, Susan Berman, was found shot execution-style in her Los Angeles home. Just before her death, police were planning to question her about Kathleen's disappearance. Durst denied involvement, but the pressure was mounting. Then, in 2001, while hiding out in Texas disguised as a mute woman, Durst was arrested for the murder and dismemberment of his neighbor, Morris Black. He claimed self-defense, and somehow he was acquitted. For years, Durst evaded justice. But it was the HBO documentary, The Jinx, that changed everything. In a shocking final episode, Durst went into the bathroom with a hot mic still on and muttered to himself, "What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course." That audio reignited public and legal interest. In 2021, Robert Durst was finally convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Before he could face the trial for Kathleen's death, Durst died in 2022 from cardiac arrest. Next up, it's another New York resident, Michael Skakel. Michael grew up in one of America's most powerful families, related by marriage to the Kennedys, raised in a wealthy Connecticut neighborhood, and seemingly untouchable. But in 2002, decades after a brutal crime rocked his hometown, Skakel was convicted of murdering 15-year-old Martha Moxley. The murder happened in 1975 in the affluent suburb of Greenwich. Martha was found dead in her backyard, bludgeoned with a golf club, one that came from the Skakel home. She had been last seen there the night before, hanging out with Michael and his older brother. The case quickly grew media attention, but stalled for years, with no arrests and no clear answers. Then, nearly 25 years later, investigators reopened the case. A mix of circumstantial evidence, shifting alibis, and statements from people who claimed Skakel had confessed to them in rehab programs led to his arrest. At the time of the murder, Michael had been 15 years old. In 2002, now in his 40s, he was found guilty and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. But the story didn't end there. Skakel's defense team launched a relentless appeal campaign, arguing his trial lawyer had been ineffective. In 2023, a judge agreed, and his conviction was overturned. He was released on bail after serving more than a decade behind bars. In 2018, the Connecticut Supreme Court reinstated his conviction, only to reverse itself in 2019, clearing the way for prosecutors to drop the case entirely. Michael Skakel has always maintained his innocence, and no one else has ever been charged in Martha Moxley's death. The case remains one of the most controversial and debated in recent American legal history, where justice, wealth, and influence collided in a way few could have predicted. Third on the list, it's a billionaire who was part of his wife's death but never charged with her murder. We're talking about Hans Christian Rousing. Hans was born into immense wealth. As an heir to the Tetra Pak fortune, the global packaging empire that made his family billions, he lived a life of privilege. But behind the gated mansions and charity galas was a man battling deep personal demons. And in 2012, his story took a dark and tragic turn. Rousing and his wife, Eva, were known in elite circles, especially for their philanthropic work, but they were also known for their long public struggle with addiction. In July 2012, Eva was found dead in their London townhouse. What made the story even more shocking wasn't just her death, it was the fact that Hans had lived with her decomposing body for weeks before anyone found out. When police arrived at the house, originally for a minor drug-related matter, they discovered Eva's body hidden under a pile of garbage bags and air fresheners. Hans admitted he hadn't reported her death because he couldn't bear to let her go. It was a stunning revelation. A billionaire, paralyzed by grief, surrounded by wealth, yet living in squalor with the body of his wife. Hans Christian Rousing wasn't charged with murder. Instead, he pled guilty to preventing the lawful burial of a body and was handed a suspended sentence, along with a court-mandated drug rehabilitation order. The case raised questions about how addiction can devastate lives, regardless of wealth or status. Eva's death marked a tragic chapter in the Rousing family's legacy. While Hans has largely stayed out of the public eye since, his story remains a haunting reminder that money doesn't insulate anyone from pain, addiction, or loss, and that sometimes the most heartbreaking tragedies happen behind the grandest doors. Fourth on the list is John DuPont. John was born into one of America's wealthiest families, heir to the vast DuPont chemical fortune. Despite his privileged upbringing, John's life was marked by eccentricity and a deep fascination with sports and science. He founded the Delaware Museum of Natural History and authored several works on ornithology and conchology. However, it was his involvement in the world of wrestling that would lead to a tragic downfall. In the 1980s, DuPont established a state-of-the-art wrestling facility on his Foxcatcher Farm estate in Pennsylvania. This facility attracted top-tier athletes, including Olympic gold medalist Dave Schultz. Schultz, renowned for his wrestling prowess and coaching abilities, moved onto the estate with his family to train and mentor other wrestlers under DuPont's sponsorship. As the years progressed, those close to DuPont observed a decline in his mental stability. He became increasingly paranoid, exhibiting erratic behavior that alarmed many. On January 26, 1996, this instability culminated in a horrific act. DuPont shot and killed Dave Schultz in the driveway of Schultz's residence on the estate. The motive remains unclear, but it's believed that DuPont's deteriorating mental health played a significant role. Following the murder, DuPont barricaded himself inside his mansion, leading to a tense 2-day standoff with law enforcement. Eventually, he was apprehended and taken into custody. In 1997, DuPont was tried and found guilty of third-degree murder, but was deemed mentally ill. He was sentenced to 13 to 30 years in prison, and on December 9, 2010, DuPont died behind bars at the age of 72. Fifth on the list, Phil Spector. Phil was a legendary music producer, hailed for revolutionizing pop music with his iconic wall of sound technique. He worked with some of the biggest names in the industry, from the Beatles to Tina Turner, but behind the genius was a man with a long history of erratic behavior, violent outbursts, and obsession with control. That dark side came into full view in 2003. In the early morning hours of February 3, 2003, actress Lena Clarkson was found dead from a gunshot wound in the foyer of Spector's California mansion. The two had met just hours earlier at a nightclub, and she'd accompanied him home. According to Spector's chauffeur, the producer emerged from the house holding a gun and said, "I think I killed somebody." Spector claimed the shooting was accidental, that Clarkson had shot herself, but the forensic evidence and witness testimony painted a different picture. It wasn't just the gun, it was his history. Several women came forward saying he'd pulled guns on them in the past during arguments. This time, someone ended up dead. His first trial in 2007 ended in a hung jury, but in 2009, during a retrial, Phil Spector was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 19 years to life in prison. It was a shocking fall for a man once considered one of the most influential figures in music. Phil Spector died in prison in 2021 from complications related to COVID-19. His legacy remains deeply complicated. On one hand, a visionary producer who shaped modern pop. On the other, a violent man whose need for control ended in tragedy. His story is a haunting example of how talent and power can mask deep dysfunction until it's too late. Next up, and we're heading across the pond to the UK and Nicholas van Hoogstraten, who is one of the UK's most infamous and controversial businessmen, a billionaire property tycoon known as much for his ruthless dealings as his staggering wealth. At one point, his property empire was valued in the hundreds of millions, with vast holdings across London and the south of England. But behind the empire was a man with a reputation for intimidation, arrogance, and eventually deadly violence. In 1999, a long-running legal feud between Van Hoogstraten and fellow businessman Mohammed Sabir Raja took a full turn. Raja, a former business partner, was suing Van Hoogstraten over a property deal gone bad. Before the case could proceed, Raja was attacked in his South London home by two hired men, stabbed multiple times, and left to die in front of his family. Police quickly linked the murder to Van Hoogstraten, though he wasn't the one who carried out the attack. Prosecutors argued that he had orchestrated the hit. In 2002, he was convicted not of murder, but of manslaughter and conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. But the story didn't end there. In 2003, the conviction was overturned on appeal due to questions about how the trial was conducted. He was released from prison, sparking public outrage. However, in 2005, a civil court found him liable for Raja's death and ordered him to pay £6 million to the victim's family. Despite his legal troubles, Van Hoogstraten remained defiant, at one point calling the court system a joke and continuing to flaunt his wealth. He even began constructing a massive palace-like mansion called Hamilton Palace in Sussex, meant to be Britain's largest private residence, though it remains unfinished. Another Brit and, interestingly, another property developer, Peter Morgan, was a self-made multi-millionaire, a successful property developer living in rural Wales, worth an estimated £800 million. He had wealth, freedom, and the kind of quiet power that comes with money. But in 2016, his name hit headlines, not for business, but for murder. What shocked many was not just the brutality of the crime, but the bizarre obsession behind it. Morgan had become involved with 25-year-old Georgina Simmons, a former burlesque dancer and escort. Their arrangement was transactional. He paid for her lifestyle, funded her home, and set her up with an allowance. But Morgan fell deeply, irrationally in love. Georgina, by all accounts, didn't feel the same. She had confided to friends that she wanted out of the relationship and was planning to blackmail Morgan using recordings and secrets he'd shared with her. Terrified of losing control and his reputation, Morgan took matters into his own hands. He installed secret surveillance in the home he provided for Georgina and discovered her plans to leave and expose him. In January 2016, driven by jealousy and paranoia, he strangled her with a rope inside that very house. Morgan kept her body in the outbuilding of his estate for days, before finally calling the police and admitting to the crime. In court, he claimed he lost control, but prosecutors argued it was a cold, calculated act. The jury agreed. In December 2016, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. Last up, and we're heading over to China, where Yuan Baojing was one of China's rising tycoons in the 1990s, a billionaire businessman who built his fortune through futures trading and investments in telecommunications. At just 36, he was already head of the Jinhao Group and listed among China's wealthiest. But beneath the surface of that success was a man driven by obsession and paranoia, and it led to one of the most sensational murder cases in China's modern business history. In 1997, Yuan lost millions in a stock market deal and became convinced he'd been manipulated by a securities broker named Liu Han. Yuan paid a former police officer named Wang Jing to kill Liu. The attempt failed, and Wang was later arrested. But instead of keeping quiet, Yuan allegedly became worried Wang would expose him. In a desperate move to cover his tracks, Yuan arranged for another man to murder Wang before he could testify. This second hit went through, and Yuan's involvement eventually unraveled. He was arrested and charged with orchestrating both murder plots. In 2005, Yuan Baojing was convicted and sentenced to death. His brother and two accomplices were also convicted for their roles in the crimes. The case attracted massive attention in China, not just because of the brutality, but because of Yuan's status. He was one of the first billionaires in China to face capital punishment. Despite last-minute appeals and intervention from high-level officials, Yuan Baojing was executed by lethal injection in March 2006. His case became a powerful warning in China's booming economy that no amount of money, connections, or influence could protect you from the law. For Yuan, the fall from billionaire to executed convict was as fast and as dramatic as his rise. What are your thoughts on this topic? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more in-depth discussions. Thanks for watching.